Organo, industry co-chair. If we could maybe just quickly, do you want to do a roll call?
Yeah.
Okay, Ed, you start. We'll go over right down.
Ed Stewart, Tampa Industry Program.
Maya Burke, Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
Approval, yes, sir. On JK.
Covered now, Pasco County.
This hand space gets written by someone. Okay, good looks for Hillsborough County. Vote for the handle, citation to the city. Rodney and to vote for the Gary Lockwood. First paragraph of
And then I don't know how we do it online, but if people want to jump in and identify themselves.
And it would be easiest if you did it at the mic so that they can hear. So for the folks in the room, there's about 20 people online, and the way that the audio in this room works is they can really only hear you if you are speaking into this microphone. So I know it's awkward, but if we get to a point where it's important that everybody actually hear things, either we're going to have to repeat what you say, or I'm just going to ask you to please come up to the microphone so that everyone can participate equally.
So I'm going to announce folks online now. Barb Goding. You want to just unmute your mic and say hi and who you're representing? Colin Bartholomew. Hold on just a second. We're not hearing audio in the room. This one, the echo canceling speakerphone.
You shouldn't have to, have you touched this? Okay, it shouldn't be in there. Should be. Something like on and.
Well, we're not hearing folks from that are joining online. I'm going to continue just to run through the names that I see. So I announced Barb Goding, Colin Bartholomew.
Yes.
Oh, we hear you now. Excellent. Issa Lee. If you could go ahead and unmute yourself and announce. Yep.
Okay, this is Issa. I'm with Pale Blue Dog Consulting.
Thank you, Issa. Adam Wood.
Sorry,
And
Adam Wood here from Hillsborough County Public Utilities.
is it Tony Aguilar?
Tiffany Aguilar, Hillsborough County Public Utilities.
Thank you, Tiffany. Sorry about that.
You're good.
Carter Barrett.
Barrett Carter, Geosyntech Consultants.
Brooke Driscoll.
Brooke Driscoll, City of Largo.
H. Bryan.
There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. This is Heather Bryan. I am with Sarasota County Stormwater.
Thank you, Heather. Heather Maggio.
Heather Maggio with the City of Tampa Engineering.
Ilya Balcom.
Ilya Balcom, Duke Energy.
Jonah Mick.
Hi, Jonah Mick, Pasco County.
Joel Johnson.
Present, Joel Johnson, FDOT District 7.
Mike Wessel,
Hi, Mike Wessel, ESA.
Nicole Polio, hear you yet, Nicole. Looks like you're representing Res, though. Pete Owens,
Good afternoon, everyone. Pete Owens from Applied Sciences.
Ryan Countess,
Hi, Ryan Countess with Pale Blue Dot Consulting.
Simon Boland,
Simon Boland, Hillsborough County Extension.
Vanessa B,
Vanessa Bazo, Florida Department of Agriculture.
Ken Weaver,
Yes, Ken Weaver from Florida DEP, and I have several people in the office with me.
Kevin O'Donnell here, Program Administrator.
Ben Morales.
Miranda Anderson.
That's it.
Thank you, guys. And I think that's everyone I see online. If I missed anyone, please announce yourself now. All right. I think we're good. Did you get all those wrong? Yeah, I'll go run through it as long as this tab opens. There it goes. All sorts of technical issues today. Thank you guys for coming this afternoon. It's been, as you all know, a series of conversations we've been having with the Nitrogen Management Consortium. Last we left, I think, the full consortium back in August. This conversation was headed back to the old Tampa Bay Working Group to kind of shepherd a sort of recommendation that we'd bring back to the full Nitrogen Management Consortium. So that's what I'm going to kind of explain today, sort of the process that we've undertaken to come to a recommendation through the old Tampa Bay Working Group. So just to kind of set the stage for the conversation, we as the estuary program staff are here to kind of shepherd this recommendation through the full Nitrogen Management Consortium process. We've provided a recommendation for Old Tampa Bay in the past, and several options kind of manifested from those discussions. And since we last met, the Old Tampa Bay Working Group has gone through a series of kind of votes to formalize that recommendation for Old Tampa Bay. So again, our role as estuary programs to try to shepherd this process through the decision-making process of the full consortium now. And we ask that you as the consortium, consider sort of the full weight of the work and activity that we've been undertaking now for about a year and a half. And in signing up for the declaration of cooperation at the start of this reasonable assurance process. So if it does come to a formal vote, we'll kind of go through a roll call process, and I'll kind of explain that at the end. But there is a formal voting process for a Nitrogen Management Consortium recommendation and a final action in the Nitrogen Management Consortium. And we'll kind of explain the differences between those two. I don't think we're at a final consortium action just yet, but we'll kind of talk about that later. And then just to keep the conversation fluid and rolling, building off past discussions, we just ask that you think about framing any input to the process in the affirmative. about what we should be doing moving forward rather than sort of backtracking and kind of rehashing conversations that we've already had several times through these groups. So that's what our expectations are for this meeting and kind of setting the stage there. But I wanted to give you all an overview similarly to what we've done for the Old Tampa Bay Working Group and kind of review the findings from some of the capacity work that we've invested in over the past year and a half. I think the main outcome of that new science that was developed is reaffirming that nitrogen loads matter in the space segment. There's sort of that conversation heading into it that there's these other management actions that we could focus on, but managing nitrogen loads sort of remains as sort of the core tenets of what we're meeting here as a nitrogen management consortium group on. And the science that was developed through some of that early work reaffirmed a lot of those relationships with the chlorophyll conditions in Old Tampa Bay. We do know that some of the numeric nutrient criteria that have been developed in the past based on that 92-94 reference period were during a time where we had a lot less hydrologic inputs to the space segment relative to the past 10, 15 plus years. In fact, since 2001, in Old Tampa Bay, we've actually exceeded sort of that hydrologic reference period in every year since 2001. So that's something to consider and why we kind of went or we heard recommendations that kind of questioned whether or not that reference period was still applicable for this base segment. Some of the outputs of the additional analyses from that work indicated that if we moved away from a nitrogen delivery ratio, there was more likelihood of tying a chlorophyll A condition to an absolute load condition. And that recommendation was what we were shepherding over this past year in terms of those discussions with the Old Tampa Bay Working Group. That recommendation, there's discussion back and forth with many member participants of the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, and that was not formally decided upon at this point. So I'm just putting it out there in terms of what science was developed thus far. And then what we also know from that work was that the action plan projects that have been submitted thus far, at least over the this reasonable assurance period over 2022 to 2026, indicate that we're estimate about a 5-ton or so reduction, primarily from street sweeping activities amongst the MS4s. We also know that if full implementation of some of the Senate Bill 64 plans for some of the wastewater treatment plants, that would provide approximately about 37 tons of additional loads when fully implemented by 2032. So in total, we're looking about 42 tons of potential load reductions in that base segment by 2032 if everything was implemented as discussed in those plans or as carried out through some of the management of your MS4 permits within your respective jurisdictions. We also know from the ability capacity assessment, if we're going towards an absolute load target that was somewhere close to that 486 tons per year federally recognized TMDL, that current conditions would need probably a doubling of that load reduction to bring us more in line to that 486 similar capacity finding consistently in that base segment. So those are sort of the outcomes of some of that similar capacity work. There's 3 task reports that we provided prior presentations on, as well as provide those documents to the consortium for further review and comment on. So heading into sort of the discussions with the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, what we also heard during this time period was several considerations that were building off the reasonable assurance plan and some of the findings in the past. So we know that when we're making this decision here, we want to be sort of consistent with what was developed in the 2020 reasonable assurance update, where we had 3 consecutive years of not attaining chlorophyll A standards in Old Tampa Bay segment. And that really drive the need to kind of have a discussion about how to better manage that system moving forward. And that was solidified in commitments through a declaration of cooperation of most of the entities that have allocations in the Old Tampa Bay Bay segment and signing on to this commitment to work together towards identifying a a way to move forward and hopefully improve that base segment over the next 5 years, this RA cycle. We also want to recognize that additional work and research has been done in terms of trying to understand what the true assimilative capacity of that base segment should be. Like I said, there's been some candid discussions on whether or not that absolute load of 486 tons is the right one moving forward, and I think that's still debatable. I think there's room for additional research there. We also, when bringing these conversations to the Estuary Programs Management and Policy Board, we heard pretty loud and clear that a lot of the will to act and invest was contingent on sort of regulatory requirements, and that really provided the impetus for funding to flow and decisions to be made of decision makers, elected officials, to actually fund projects to address a water quality concern. So in having these discussions in Old Tampa Bay, we're trying to generate the political will to act, to address these concerns and get the space segment back on track. We also heard pretty loud and clear that most of the entities in the room were not interested in a reallocation process. So if some other number other than 486 was developed for the space segment, that would probably require some sort of reallocation of the entities represented in the base segment. And we also heard loud and clear that nitrogen is one piece of the story in that base segment. We know that there's other considerations that are driving chlorophyll A conditions, including tidal circulation and high residence times in certain portions of that base segment. So we don't necessarily want to take off the table other management actions and alternatives that might have a benefit in synergies with nutrient load reduction projects in the future. So those are all sort of considerations that we're trying to weigh over the course of this past year. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve is improving the marginal conditions in Old Tampa Bay and ultimately, hopefully, getting more seagrass coverage back in that bay segment. The last assessment in 2024 showed continuing declines in seagrass coverage in that bay segment. It's at an all-time low, lower than any period of time where we've had data, even going back to the 1980s. So that's still of a concern in terms of us as the SRE program of managing the system for the benefit, improving water quality for the benefit of improving seagrass coverage in that bay segment in particular. And really why we're all here is that we're trying to shepherd a process that provides reasonable assurance to the state of Florida that water quality standards are going to be met to achieve that end that I just explained. And really that's why we're having these discussions. That's why they've been so candid and trying to come up with a plan moving forward for that base segment. So that was kind of the setup that we provided at the prior Old Tampa Bay working group meetings. The last meeting was on November 20th, and we didn't have everyone represented in the room. So of the entities that have allocations, those 7 listed on the left side were actually present at the meeting. And we had a couple other agencies that have contributed to the Nitrogen Management Consortium, the Reasonable Assurance Update, present at that meeting as well. Those major entities that have allocations that we attempted to follow up on are listed there in the middle, and we've actually had contact with all those entities now. And then there's 7 other CDDs in Hillsborough County that we've invited to participate in a follow-up survey after this meeting, but we really haven't heard one way or another from those 7 CDDs where their preference might land. So for I think these discussions, I think we've had conversations with all the major municipalities, local governments, as well as funding entities that have been participating in the Nitrogen Management Consortium fairly consistently over this RA cycle now. And what we try to do is present a sort of series of questions to them, first on the timing of action and reporting on the timing of action to the department. So the first question was centered primarily around whether or not there was still a desire to develop an addendum that would be presented to the Department of Environmental Protection prior to the full submittal of the reasonable assurance update. The second option was to formalize the recommendation from the Old Tampa Bay Work Group and run it through the consortium for full inclusion in the 2027 reasonable assurance update. Another option that came out during those discussions was to kind of delay any recommendation for the space segment until the next RA cycle, which would be the 2032 RA update. So we took a series of 2 votes. First vote was for those 3 options to hit on the top 2. And that's what you kind of see to the left. And the final voting, the second round of voting, indicated that the preference of the Old Tampa Bay Work Group was to formalize a recommendation as part of the official 2027 reasonable assurance update delivery to the department. So that's sort of the timing of this recommendation of how we're going to provide it to the regulatory agencies and get their full feedback. And then sort of the how are we going to manage the system to address these water quality concerns moving forward? There's, again, 3 sort of options that we presented to the Old Tampa Bay Working Group. The first option was basically that came out during prior discussions of that working group of identifying projects both in the current RA cycle, the 2022 to 2026 time period, as well as any additional projects that might occur after 2026. And that's sort of what I've highlighted before of our potential tally of what those projects might represent for that base segment that equate to about 42 tons. So provide that to the department as sort of our response to these water quality concerns in Old Tampa Bay. The second option was the recommendation that we've been fostering through the assembly capacity update of looking at an alternative compliance framework over the next RA cycle that considered the absolute load and whether or not we retain the absolute load in the face of not meeting chlorofluoride water quality standards over the next 5 years. So that was sort of the second recommendation that was identified. And then the third option that was discussed of the Old Tampa Bay Working Group was basically going back to the drawing board and identifying whether or not identifying a true summative capacity for that Old Tampa Bay segment was required. So there's pluses and minuses to all those sort of recommendations. And again, a 2-tiered vote led to a fairly close vote at the November 20th meeting. About 8 participants in the meeting at the time identified the listing of projects as sort of the response that we'd forward on to the department versus the second option of looking at an absolute load over the next reasonable assurance period. And then because there were concerns that not every entity was represented at that meeting, we took some time to reach out to those entities that were not present. And we actually had a follow-up survey this past week trying to get input and their formal sort of preference from each of the entities represented in Old Tampa Bay. And it really didn't change anything from that November 20th meeting. 8 responses, 8 entities indicated that identifying those projects in the current RA cycle and future RA cycles is the appropriate response to forward on to DEP to better manage this Old Tampa Bay segment. So we also sort of created a narrative recommendation from that Old Tampa Bay Working Group based on those discussions. And I think this is what the consortium would be considering today. And it reads, the Old Tampa Bay Working Group recommends that the demonstration of reasonable assurance for the Old Tampa Bay segment in the 2027 reasonable assurance update reflect the projects implemented over the 2022 to 2026 period and those projects planned for implementation over the 2027 through 2031 plus period. So any future projects beyond this RA cycle. They also recommended that additional projects and research are also recommended to more fully understand and achieve water quality conditions supportive of seagrass recovery in the space segment over the next RA cycle. And it was also suggested that, based on this recommendation, we thought it wise to probably develop a decision memo that we'd forward on to the Department of Environmental Protection to get their formal perspective on the acceptability of this recommendation to manage the system moving forward. So that kind of an overview and summary of where we've been at with the Old Tampa Bay Working Group. We're pretty much at this this top box in terms of the flow chart of decisions now that needs to be considered by the full consortium. So the Old Tampa Bay Working Group has developed this recommendation, and now we're at this process of the full consortium considering it. If the full consortium votes in the affirmative, then we're going to move forward and develop a decision memo that we forward on to DEP and US EPA for their formal input to that recommendation. And then, if there's no's in either circumstances, we kind of go through this loop and it gets sent back to the Old Tampa Bay Working Group for them to come up with a new recommendation if it's not acceptable to the consortium or DEP at that time. So we're here to kind of shepherd you all through that process. There is an official voting protocol that we've developed through the consortium. And as I mentioned, there's sort of 2 tiers in that voting protocol. I think we're in this left tier of this being sort of a consortium recommendation that we're considering to develop a decision memo from. It's not necessarily a final action or acceptance of a final RA plan that has this information in it, which would formalize a more traditional vote on the right. But we've done this before in very limited circumstances. But the way that the tiers break down on the left, any participants, basically any entities with allocations and or providing funding support to the consortium would be allowed to vote. We only have 1 vote per entity, and we'd go through sort of a roll call to decide on sort of whether or not there's a majority preference of accepting or not accepting that recommendation. As I mentioned, I don't think we're at this stage of a final consortium action, but if we were at that stage, what that entails is only those entities that have an allocation and have provided funding support during this current reasonable assurance cycle would be allowed to vote, and it would be a simple majority of those entities represented in 1 vote per entity. So that's where we're at in kind of a nutshell. I would be happy to entertain any sort of questions around that. And dialogue, but that's where we're at in terms of the Old Tampa Bay Working Group's recommendation to the full consortium.
So Ed, quick question.
Can I convince you to talk into this?
Oh, yeah, of course.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, DJ. So question for Ed was, number 1, are you asking today or recommending today or suggesting today that we should have that first vote to kind of understand where we stand? And then maybe second question, if we don't do that today, which I know Maya doesn't want to see that happen, but I think we want to proceed with that vote today. Is it your opinion, and is it the opinion of the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, that any additional discussion would result in a different outcome? Or is this what they are endorsing as kind of like the consensus path forward for this RA update?
Yeah, so I think we're at the stage, to answer your first question, I think we're at the stage for the consortium to consider this recommendation as forwarded on from the Old Tampa Bay Working Group. And I think we've been talking about it for over a year, so I think it's apropos to take a vote if that's what the decision of the consortium is. Remind me of the second question.
The second question was whether, and I don't know if we could maybe query some of them here, but I want to make sure you're not speaking, out of turn, so to speak, and that this is what they endorse as a group, as the consensus.
Yeah, and just our observations of the survey that we forwarded on over this past week, and those are results on the right. There is now more consensus towards the first option of identifying projects and providing that as sort of the reasonable assurance for Old Tampa Bay moving forward. And I'd be happy for other Old Tampa Bay Working Group members if there's any discussion around that, or this would be time to do it.
So I'll certainly hold for other questions and discussion, but I'm prepared to make a motion to call for that vote at some point here during this meeting. So thank you.
conversations.
This is Delia from Duke Energy. I mean, as from the Old Tampa Bay Working Group perspective, I mean, we discussed the different options, and this is the recommendation, but we anticipated that there would be additional questions and discussions from the consortium in general. So, Tino, I think that's kind of like what you're trying to gauge.
Yeah, that I believe that's what Tina was asking, if there's other
Yeah.
conversation that.
Yeah, I think it's anticipated that there will be additional questions and discussions during this meeting.
The floor is yours.
And maybe the members from the working group that there were some concerns mentioned during our discussions about timelines and budgets and things like that, and if those working group members could share those concerns, I think that would help the rest of the consortium kind of like understand our recommendation.
Does anyone want to share? So I think my best recollection of some of the conversations that were had at the meeting amongst the working group members was, the continued concern that the true assimilative capacity was not emerging from the science that was developed so far. So that was sort of why going down this project route of identifying projects and in the interim performing additional research as well as identifying additional projects would be sort of the preference of I think the majority that's now represented. There was other concern from the working group members, a minority of the working group members represented that, that would seem to indicate a delay in action of addressing the concerns and sort of kicking the can down the road. And that was, I think, some of the concern that the ESHRE program has expressed in the past in formulating this recommendation, whether or not it provides enough reasonable assurance, particularly for the department to make that determination of this RA cycle that Old Tampa Bay segment would achieve water quality standards in the future. Especially with some of the findings of the similar capacity assessment indicating that the load reductions that are identified are not insignificant, but they're not potentially enough to have an effect on bringing chlorophyll conditions in line and being consistently met in the future. Ilya, is that summarize most of the conversation, or were there other things that you were thinking about that I missed?
No, that's a pretty good summary. I guess the other, we did have a lot of discussion about the normal, the hydrologic load versus the normal load, and I guess it got clarified that is being reported anyway in the current reports. So it's not like we're not providing that information to DEP. It is included in the reports anyway, because that's one of the questions that I had about, if we're not going to use the not the hydrologic load, but the normalized load, at least report it, and we already do that. So we can continue to see those numbers and see what kind of impact they're having, even though we're not changing what we're being held to. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I'll just restate it. So I think the discussion from the Old Tampa Bay Working Group is that the existing numeric nutrient criteria related to chlorophyll and the nitrogen and phosphorus delivery ratios would still be assessed as part of the reasonable assurance compliance framework. But to get to those numbers, we have to report on absolute loads and generate those numbers anyway. So we're going to continue to kind of look at those and report on that as we've traditionally done as part of the regional assurance process. We're just not taking sort of that next step of developing an alternative compliance framework around those absolute loads.
Thanks.
Do you mind coming up here? Thank you. Just so I don't butcher the restatement.
I certainly don't want to delay the vote any longer. I was just curious because I didn't listen to the old Tampa Bay working group meeting. Was any discussion given to the project that we're starting with looking at larger potential regional stormwater projects in Old Tampa Bay, in the context of looking forward to using projects, to meet some of those reduction requirements?
Yeah, there wasn't specific conversation at that meeting about that project, but certainly that work, if you're not unaware, the SRA program has restore funding to look at developing a multi-jurisdictional stormwater master plan for the Old Tampa Bay segment. And from that plan, hopefully 2 projects that could be implemented through future release of restore funds could be implemented. But we haven't identified those projects yet, but that would be certainly part of those additional research and identification of projects that is called for in the last sentence of the recommendation, and kind of fits into building our body of knowledge and work that we know is necessary in that Bay segment. But that's sort of outside the purview of the Nitrogen Management Consortium. That's the necessary program initiative that we're advancing. It certainly benefit the consortium participants in Old Tampa Bay. We hope, we feel, and we hope. Julie, can you?
If we switch today, this recommendation forward to DEP, would DEP give us and they give us an inkling over if they would approve this or if they need more discussion on their side?
Yep. So in the company, there's a request from the consortium participants to sort of gauge the perspectives of DEP on whether or not this recommendation, what the opinion of the department of this recommendation might be.
Wants to go. So I think this is Ben Morales, and I think our perspective is that we have some concern that assurance is going to be met. The reasonable assurance plan process triggered the assimilative capacity study, as we know, and in that study there were recommendations, and it seems like most of the action associated with those recommendations will be deferred. As Ed mentioned, there are some projects, but maybe not enough projects to get to the target load reductions. So I think we do have some concern. However, we always get assurance through projects, and if additional projects are identified, then we might be able to get to that assurance level that we need.
Sven.
If that is,
We're not able to hear.
So there's a follow-up question to the department. And the question was, if the consortium decided that an absolute load compliance framework, would that be more preferable to the department versus identification of projects to maintain reasonable assurance for that pay segment, basically? Did I capture it?
So I'll chime in for this one. This is Kevin O'Donnell. I don't think so, because I think we're really more reliant on nutrient reductions. But having said that, the crux of it is probably that the assimilative capacity analysis identified future things that should be evaluated and implemented. And that's what, in our opinion, would probably be like, that's demonstrating reasonable progress continuation.
Thank you. Bryn.
You mentioned. I know you guys don't want to do it, but it just makes it a lot easier.
I just had a question. You mentioned the Old Tampa Bay Working Group discussed the true, quote unquote, true assimilative capacity may not have been identified in the study. Was there discussion on anticipated or prospective true capacity being higher or lower than the existing in NC? Was that part of the discussion of the working group?
So when we presented on that option, what we looked back on was some prior work that was conducted, and the best that we could tell from all the tools that have been developed thus far, there would be a range of anywhere from about 350 to 560 tons as what identified as the assimilative capacity for the Old Tampa Bay segment from those prior tools and the current effort to identify the assimilative capacity. So it was within that range of 486 tons, but it could be higher, it could be lower depending on the tool that's applied and which sort of period of record you're looking at as well.
Just going to step in as a facilitator from a process stewardship point. We've been having these conversations for the better part of almost 2 years now. And I think those are valid questions that have been discussed repeatedly. But I want to kind of ask you to think back to that flowchart diagram that we discussed. Really, we think we've gotten to a point of consensus with the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, which is the recommendation that's before the consortium today. And so the question before the consortium is this also acceptable to you? And if it is, then the estuary program will draft a decision memo, bring it back to the full consortium that we can submit to the department for their formal kind of weigh in on what's going forward. But we can't continue to sort of be in a loop of the same options at every meeting. So if it's not acceptable to you all, then what happens is you send this conversation back to the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, and we will continue those conversations to formulate a new recommendation there. But I don't think it's appropriate. And so every time we kind of go in that direction, I'm going to stand up at the mic and remind you about process stewardship. And today the question before you is the recommendation, the consensus point that we've been able to generate from the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, acceptable to the consortium? We can talk about it, but that's the question before us.
Maya's ready to crack the whip again in summer. You look like you want to say something, Tony. I'm gonna make you come up here.
If I do certain things, I'm gonna say, I hear you want to send this back to the Old Tampa Bay Working Group.
No, one of the things, I wasn't able to attend the Old Tampa Bay Working Group the last couple of times, but I guess the question that I've posed, to the program in particular, is what consideration has been given to the advancement in science and data since 1996 when I came up with 486. I'm not sure if there was any discussion as to exactly how 486 was developed. And maybe if you knew the story behind that, you wouldn't be so willing to jump on that number. But I think beyond that, we have made advancements. We made advancements with Pinellas County on an improved way of taking into account hydrological normalization. And we've been doing that with Pinellas County with their data recently. The other thing is to recognize that we have 20 years of data, more than what we had in 1996. How in the world can you legitimately ignore that? Is a good question for me.
So the recommendation is not for the absolute load unless there's discussion of taking that back to the working group to kind of work through those conversations. I think we've developed a couple of new documents that I would encourage everyone to take a look at and identify how those numbers were recommended over the past year, because there has been additional analyses that contributed to that work. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, unless there's more questions or comments that are productive, and not, kind of rehashing old discussions, I think we should go ahead and try and get a vote on this recommendation from the CDC. And then finally, like you said, if we don't get a positive outcome on that, then it goes back to them for further discussions. And it's maybe incorporated at these other faculty questions.
There's someone.
How do you want that framing?
So I think that the motion would be to accept the recommendation of the Old Tampa Bay Working Group as is presented here on the slide, and to direct staff to draft a decision memo to come back to a full consortium meeting the beginning of 2026. So you decide if you like the decision memo or not to send it forward. But you're basically deciding whether or not you accept this recommendation from the Old Tampa Bay Working Group.
So we got a motion and second, and we're gonna do a roll call vote of all participants of the consortium, if that works for you. Yeah, but are we considering this a final consortium action?
When you say entities, are you asking like one vote for Pinellas County, one vote for Mosaic, or are you only talking about the entities in the whole Tampa Bay Working Group? I'm just making sure.
That's what we're here to do. One vote per entity represented here today. Yes. So I'm going to run through. Here, let me, we'll do at the same time so I don't make sure we get the same.
So before we get in, can we actually restate that motion for the record? The motion is to accept the recommendation of the Tampa Bay Working Group as presented in today's documents and direct the estuary programs decision reflecting that.
To bring back to the full consortium to vote.
Just bear with me a second. We're going to do it at the same time so we don't miss anything.
See.
What I'm going to do is run through the entities identified that identified themselves earlier today when we went through introductions. And what we're looking for is one vote per entity represented in the consortium to either accept or decline the recommendation. So I'm going to start with Florida Department of Transportation.
Ed, is this a vote yay or nay, or is
correct?
And yay would be in favor of the
correct
on the screen. Okay, I'll just be consistent and vote yay.
Thanks, Joel. Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County. City of Clearwater.
Yes, in favor.
City of Largo. City of Oldsmar.
Yes, for Largo.
Yes, for Largo. Oldsmar. Safety Harbor.
Yes.
St. Petersburg. Tampa.
Yes, we accept the Old Tampa Bay Working Group recommendation.
Duke Energy.
Yes.
Hillsborough County. Kinder Morgan. Manatee County. Mosaic. Pasco. Pinellas. Sarasota.
There, can you hear me okay? For Sarasota?
Yes,
I think I'm a voting member, so yes, aye.
you are. AEDC of Hillsborough County, Simon.
Yes.
FDAX.
Yes.
Well, I think that's majority at this point. So. I don't know if we need to go through do you want to? FDEP.
Yay, yes.
Swift mode.
Yeah, so for a final action, you would have.
Yeah. Consortium recommendation. Estuary program's going to abstain. TBRPC. And then Oldsmar. So we have the recommendation accepted by the consortium. So we'll Yep. Yeah, I think the decision memo is not going to be too much more than what the recommendation on the screen is at this point. We did it.
Okay.
Yep.
Crack that whip, Maya. Nice job.
Yeah.
It's just a process question, so we'll come back in January or sometime in the new year as a voting allocation member vote. We'll send it to DEP. It'll likely pass. And then what? How many days does DEP have to approve or accept the recommendation? And then what happens? Do we kind of adopt that as a formal? Thank you. Yep. So we will have to schedule the meeting in probably late January is the earliest that we'll be able to practically make it. happen. We will have a date that we request a response from the department and from EPA. I'm not going to speculate on whether or not they're going to accept it or not, especially based on their comments that they've offered. So they will let us know what if they can meet the timeline, but we haven't laid that out yet. I think that'll be more clear at the January meeting. I think it's going to be a decision of this group whether you'd like it to be a final action for this decision memo or if you would like it to be another consortium recommendation. So that's a process point. We'll decide who votes on it. If you want to talk about that now and, you know, if it's clear to folks in the room which way that should go. But from my perspective, it's still just a clarifying question to the department because the actual action of adopting whatever is finally decided as a result of this back and forth won't happen until we adopt the 2027 reasonable assurance update plan. So that will be later, not in 2026, but towards the tail end of 2027. So that's when action, the final action, in my opinion, from a process standpoint would occur. Is that in line with others' expectations? Great. Stacy. Yep.
Keep adding to that spreadsheet, but is there like a hard deadline?
Yes, so we ask for you all to update your projects on a rolling basis. You all should have access to the action plan database. We've presented on the updated action plan database. We can bring that back to you again. I'll just emphasize that if this is accepted by the department and this is the course that we choose to take, it will be critical that you are not missing any of those load reduction projects, particularly in the old Tampa Bay segment. And so however we can help facilitate and support getting that information in. We will have a drop deadline. And so basically for the 2027 RA, we're going to be updating through the end of calendar year 2026. And usually we are asking for those projects to be completely entered into the database by late spring, early summer in 2027 at the absolute latest. It is much more helpful for us for you to be putting those projects in the database as you go, because we can then report back to you sort of how it looks like we are doing relative to the goals that we've laid out for ourselves. So the sooner you're able to put that information, the better. Yeah. Tony.
I'm not sure if everybody is aware of the DEP's work to develop a verification tool that is used to calculate the credit that you get for various projects. So I would suggest you go look to that because that can be very helpful in coming up with what you think those load reductions should be if you do this project.
And certainly if you're entering a project, coming up with a load reduction of what that project should entail would be important for this process. So whatever tool you want to utilize of that, please do.
Okay, ready to move on?
Yep.
All right, we're going to give Marcus some time to give us an update on 2025 water quality report.
Thought that would take a lot longer. Okay, so this time every year I give an update on provisional water quality results for the current year. So we're almost done with 2025. So that's what I'm talking about today. These are provisional in the sense that we have data for every month through October. We're still counting on November, December, probably January, February timeframe. So just keep that in mind when I show you these results. I only have information through October of this year. But based on those numbers, we have a pretty good indication about how the year is going to shake out in terms of the averages that we're looking at. So I show this framework every time, just to remind everybody about the process for assessment under the reasonable assurance plan.
Basically, through a series of yes, nos, we kind of got through this process of assessing this assimilative capacity of Old Tampa Bay. And that really all started with 2 years exceeding the chlorophyll threshold for Old Tampa Bay. And you can kind of see that through this flow chart where we kind of ended up on that. Just to kind of cut through the chase here, we're looking good for this RA period. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but you'll see the results today haven't really been wildly different from the results of the last couple of years. So it's looking like for this RA period, we won't have to, go further down this flow chart for the time being. This is the first slide I like to show. This is chlorophyll trends long-term for all the 4 major bay segments: Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough, Middle and Lower Tampa Bay. You can see 2025 added in there. And again, that 2025 average is based on data through October, and then November and December is using averages from the previous 5 years to fill those gaps. But it will probably look more or less like that same value when we get the complete year of data. The thing to note here is, yes, last year in 2024, we had some higher than normal chlorophyll. That was because of the storms that came through. But then in this year, we see that drop down again with, more what I'm calling normal conditions without storms coming in and adding a bunch of loads into the bay. So for the most part, we're looking like all of the chlorophyll averages for this year are below our threshold and below our management target as well. So that is good news. Looking at it by month, this is showing you the months of the year, red being values for 2025, and the box plots being the range of values for all of the years prior, 1975 to 2024. So you can get a sense of not only the seasonal changes in chlorophyll that we typically see, but where those ranges have been in the past. And again, these values we're seeing for 2025 throughout the year, seasonally, even in months where we have typically higher chlorophyll just due to the normal production of phytoplankton. It's been lower than, for the most part, the regulatory thresholds that we've set for each of these bay segments. It's filled with averages from the previous 5 years. So these two are, from 2020 to 2024. Yeah. And again, I'm not expecting those values to change a lot in January, February when I get the final results. And typically those values don't drive, the annual average. They're typically lower for that part of the year anyway. So you can kind of consider this as draft final or final draft, however you want to put it. So it should look similar. Looking at it by site, so these are all of the stations that EPC monitors that we use for the compliance assessments. We don't assess site level assessments when we do the compliance reports, but this is really just to give you a sense of spatially, if and when we have high chlorophyll values, how it might play out. 2025, pretty quiet year all around. This area on the west side of Old Tampa Bay, where we see, generally speaking, over the last 10, 15 years or so, higher than the normal chlorophyll averages compared to the rest of the bay segment. We did get a hit there, but again, didn't contribute to the bay segment average exceeding the threshold. And then this small hit over here from Old Tampa Bay. But again, none of these individual sites elevated the overall average for each one of the bay segments, so not really a major concern. We also assess light attenuation, that being the other component of water quality that's in our paradigm for managing water quality in seagrasses. This is showing you again the long-term trends from 1975 to present. Nothing really to note here. Everything is pretty much below the management target and regulatory thresholds. Some interesting trends in Lower Tampa Bay, for example, but we seem to be back below the target with sort of a more normal rainfall year, or rather a year without tropical storms. This is the same thing, but monthly light attenuation for the major bay segments. What's kind of interesting is I'll show you in the next slide. I have a map of the individual stations, but Old Tampa Bay had some pretty low water clarity or high light attenuation earlier in the year and into the summer that was kind of strange when we look at the chlorophyll averages relative to that. But I can show you on the map here. Again, these are the station level assessments for light attenuation, and we had a bunch of stations that were above the threshold, which was kind of interesting. And just anecdotally, when we were out in the field this year, we did notice water quality or water clarity was pretty poor in Old Tampa Bay, even though the chlorophyll values were continuing to be low. So that's kind of an anomaly that isn't really consistent with how we typically think about chlorophyll and light attenuation. But again, all of the bay-wide or bay segment averages were below the threshold. So all of this information goes into our annual water quality report card that gets published early next year. I report on this to the technical advisory committee, our boards, to you all. Obviously, for this group, the regulatory components of that water quality report card are of primary interest, but there is on the front side of that report card a management focused aspect that looks at how well we're doing attaining the management targets, which are, in theory, if they're met, should lead to a higher likelihood that the thresholds are met. So they're kind of complementary sides, but for this group, it's the regulatory components that are of interest. And it's pretty simple. You know, we're just reporting on chlorophyll in each bay segment, whether or not it exceeds the threshold, green being no, red being yes. And there it is. We're looking good. So same thing as 2024, all 4 bay segments meet the threshold. So that's good news so far for this RA period. And that should say December and November based on averages from the prior years. Okay, I haven't shown this in a while, but I think this is an interesting plot to think about what's been going on in Old Tampa Bay lately. This is not necessarily something that we know is causing this or driving this, but this is showing you pyridinium cell counts from FWC from 2014 to present. I think last time I showed this information was in the beginning of 2024. So I only had data through 2023. But what's interesting, actually, so let me just orient you to this as well. This is latitude on the y-axis, so think about it. South Old Tampa Bay, North Old Tampa Bay, and then this is basically day of the year from January through the end of the year. And these 3 lines, just to orient you, are the approximate locations of the 3 bridges. So Gandy, Howard Franklin, Courtney Campbell. And so it gives you an indication of historically over the last 10 years or so where these blooms have typically occurred in relative to the bridges, and also what time of year pyridinium has typically shown up. So what's interesting is in 2023, we started seeing a decline in pyridinium. So we did see an initial bloom in the spring, early summer, but then late summer, fall, pretty much non-existent. Where there were some hits that were considered low or medium blooms, but nothing really occurring later that year. 2024, 2025, no blooms measured by FWC. You can kind of see, I shall blow that up, these points here. These are actually instances where they actually found pyridinium, but it wasn't at a concentration that they considered a bloom. So it was there in 2024, just not at a bloom level. And then in 2025, I think there was like 1 hit here in like end of May or whatever, where they found it, but only 1 instance the entire year of this year where they found pyridinium. So pyridinium has not been an issue the last 2 or 3 years. We've spoken with FWC about this, and we don't really have a good answer as to why this has occurred. But just to keep you guys in the know of what's going on with pyro, how that may or may not be influencing the chlorophyll we're seeing in the last couple of years, this is, I think, good context to at least understanding the trends in Old Tampa Bay. Okay, we did have a request because last time I probably made the mistake of showing SSOs that have occurred over time just because that was an exercise in diving into the DEP public notice of pollution database. I want to show that again just because there was a request to see how this year compares to last year, where we had a lot of SSOs because of the storms coming in and all of the rainfall associated with that. And to remind you all, this database is a database that's from the public. Anybody can report to it, but typically it's wastewater utility operators, people from local government that are actually maintaining these facilities, monitoring the infrastructure that are running these reports. But there's a date, a narrative description of what happened, and typically in that narrative description, it says how many estimated gallons were released. And again, these gallons are a rough estimate. There's no information about the water quality or the concentrations of nutrients or contaminants in that water, and there's no indication of well, if you dive into the narrative, you can see it sometimes, but they're not all of it. Probably very few of it actually enters the bay directly. It's typically contained on site or retrieved. But there, yeah. So I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of unknowns about what this is actually telling you, but it does give you a rough estimate of relative amounts of SSOs over time. So this is, I just went through this exercise of pulling out information from each one of these text descriptions. You can see, the rubric I created would pull out this number, 25 gallons, as, the estimated volume that was released from this event. So this is what we have for the last 9 years, I think. 2024, again, because of the storms that came through, a lot of SSOs. 2025, much lower, although there is this hit for the Hillsborough Bay area. And again, this doesn't mean it went into Hillsborough Bay. It was just in the basin of Hillsborough Bay. And this is actually an indication from, or a report from a clog at a wastewater treatment plant that caused an overflow that they pretty much contained on site. In that record, I looked at it this morning.
Discharge, change the pH.
Yeah, there's some backstory to it, but that water didn't enter any public resources. It didn't go into the reclaimed lines. It didn't, I think, cause any major issues, but it was a high volume of water that was discharged, which is why you see that bump. Point being, this year, a lot less SSOs, excluding, let's just remove Hillsborough Bay here. Back to normal, I suppose, as far as SSOs go. And just to, again, remind you, this database started in 2017 after a lot of SSOs that had occurred and sort of prompted the development of this database in the first place. So we're comparing this information to a year where our best estimate of prior SSOs for that year with a lot of rainfall was 200 million gallons. And this graph goes, if I put Hillsborough Bay back in there, doesn't even go up to 90 million gallons. So not even half of what, our point of reference is for why this database was created in the first place. This was another interesting thing we looked at. There was some debate in the office about whether or not rainfall was above or below average this year or slightly below average. When I pulled the rainfall data from the district, looking at this year, it actually is pretty far below average. I think we're like 11 or 12 inches below the long-term seasonal average for Tampa Bay, at least as of last month, whenever the data were updated. So a pretty dry year. And again, I feel like that's a pretty strong reason why we're seeing the good water quality conditions that we've been seeing, not just this year, but in the prior years. Although with 2024, again, with the storms, rainfall was well above average. But that happened in the time of the year, I think, when we were sort of on the tail end of the growing season. So it didn't really trigger a large phytoplankton bloom or high growth in algae that we would normally expect should that large hydrologic load come in earlier in the year, for example. And I'll back up to seagrass just as the last thing, because again, this is like, our endpoint, I guess, in the general sense of everything we really hold sacred in Tampa Bay. But I know this has been reported. I think Chris gave a presentation on this middle of this year when the numbers first came out. But just to remind everybody, this is what the numbers look like for the major bay segments. We have gains in middle, lower, Hillsborough Bay, quite a lot in Hillsborough Bay, relatively speaking, for that bay segment. But Old Tampa Bay, as Ed said earlier, is at the lowest point since we've been recording seagrass coverage. So this is why, we still think Old Tampa Bay is in a suboptimal condition, because something is still not right there in terms of how we think about nutrient loads, algae growth, light attenuation, and seagrasses. So we have the lowest recorded ever in Old Tampa Bay. The good news is we have also our transect data that, if you're not familiar with that, this is an annual monitoring effort where we actually go out in the field, we meaning not just estuary program staff, but about a dozen different groups collaboratively go out and monitor fixed transects in the bay that have been monitored since the late 90s. And this is a complementary line of evidence when we're looking at seagrass trends that kind of fills the gap in between years when we don't have the district cover maps, but also gives us, again, an alternative line of evidence of how seagrass is doing. And so this is showing you just a rough estimate of frequency occurrence. So how many times is seagrass observed overall in each of the major bay segments? And I've color coded these by years when it's gone down, red, and years when it's gone up, green, from the preceding year. So you can see in all but lower Tampa Bay, seagrass frequency occurrence has slightly upticked, and actually quite a bit in Hillsborough Bay, relatively speaking, because there hasn't been historically a lot of seagrass there, but Haladuli is on the up and up in Hillsborough Bay. So this is, I think some indication that, this loss, this is me sort of projecting forward, but this loss we did see in seagrass recently, since 26, well, I guess almost 10 years now, either we've bottomed out or we're actually maybe coming back around to, a level where we're seeing seagrasses recover just a little bit. And that likely could be a response to just the good water quality conditions we've had in the last 4 or 5 years, because we have had several years of lower than normal rainfall conditions. And then I parse it out even more just because I tend to do these things. These are individual transects for looking at this year's data compared to 2024. And you can see green being where frequency occurrence increased and red where it decreased. So by and large, most of these transects, and this is pretty coarse, it doesn't tell the whole story, but by and large, a lot of these transects did see an increase in frequency occurrence. And that, of course, is reflected when we look at the overall bay segment frequency occurrence as well. So you can actually, if you want to go online, this map is interactive and you can see the actual changes in frequency occurrence for each one of these bay segments. Okay, so just to wrap this portion up, water quality looking good. All segments are meeting the chlorophyll threshold, at least provisionally. Same for the management targets that I didn't really talk about, but looking good so far for year 4 of 5 in this current RA period. Paradigm blooms have really declined in the last 3 years, and we're not entirely sure why that is the case, but we'll take it. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. But obviously the focus is still on Old Tampa Bay here. Is what we talked about earlier today. It's still, in my opinion, a marginal bay segment. Based on the last district map, we still are losing seagrasses there, although perhaps the next round of maps will tell a different story. And we'll just sort of take it from there as this RA progresses. So we have 1 more year of this, and then I think late 2027 we have to do the RA update. So we're nearly through this cycle. We're not going to trip 2 years of successive chlorophyll exceedances because we have 1 more year to look at. So we should be in good shape in terms of our compliance for this RA period. That's it.
I have a question. Can you just toggle between the chlorophyll trends and the light attenuation trends? Pay special attention to what happened with chlorophyll in Old Tampa Bay this year and what happened with light attenuation?
Yeah.
That.
So This is light attenuation annually. We are not exceeding the management target or the regulatory threshold for light attenuation. Oh, sorry. The management targets were good. But
But the direction for Old Tampa Bay is light attenuation ticked up in 2025.
yes,
Which
which is
then go to chlorophyll. Not that.
the chlorophyll down.
I just think that was,
It's weird.
the rest of them make more or less sense to me, but the Old Tampa Bay one doesn't. And just based on like going out and doing monitoring, the water was like real yellow and the visibility wasn't very good. So this, I think, tracks with my anecdotal observations out there, but not necessarily my understanding of the relationships that are there.
So based on what you just said, that sounds like colors, but because it's either color, vinegar, color.
Yeah.
Your instruments.
And so, yeah, so it's, I guess it was mostly nanoplanktons, what's been observed in Old Tampa Bay this year. So whether or not that's a piece of it too. I'm just calling your attention to this. Roger.
Yeah.
Did you? Yeah.
I haven't yet, but I will. It's a good point. And to Maya's point, nanoplankton counts have gone up slightly, I believe, in Old Tampa Bay. You know, we think there may be some kind of shift in the phytoplankton community that might be driving some of these changes. That is all sort of anecdotal at this point. I haven't actually looked at the data, but it's enumerated as too many to count. Oh. But those.
So then how would that explain it? Or unless they're not.
I don't think we have any answers.
Yeah.
I just thought that was notable when I looked at the data. And so I was just wanting to call everyone's attention to it. I think it raises more questions, things to consider. Yeah.
Yeah.
That can follow that successional pattern. See a loss of seagrass, increase in loss of so now you basically have sand. A lot of that sand, if you know in that things largely silts and fine rain, it's much more likely that that's going to get caught up in the water. So it makes sense that you might see something like that. Even if it may not be big changes, it may not even be statistically significant. It might be enough. The fact that the optical model to be sure.
So weird stuff happening there. We're not going to stop looking at it. Okay, from the construction. Yeah. So Chris Pratt said that there's EPC has gotten reports of increased turbidity near the Howard Franklin Bridge, presumably from the construction, right? Yep. And for those online, Stacy Day just said that there's been a lot of noted erosion in the tidal tributaries due to the storms, you know, negatively affecting the integrity of the banks. So.
Where the district would be to try to turn around those, they thought with this next week.
Roger. Yeah. Yeah, I think if you look at the data set that I showed going back to '08, I think you can begin to see the pyro there. I just showed 2014 on because it fit nicely on the screen. So, but yeah.
To Roger's point, I think this is survivable.
Yeah.
To your point, I think we found that the cysts are viable for 20 years.
And if you come to the TAC meeting on January 21st, Carrie Lopez from FWC is going to be talking about some analyses she's done looking at drivers of long-term trends in pyrodinium in Old Tampa Bay. So, and there's also going to be talk from Michael Middlebrook, University of Tampa, that did a T-birth project on Calerpa and Old Tampa Bay. What is driving changes in Calerpa recently. I won't spoil it for you.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we have the last item of our agenda. This is the 2022-24 loading estimates. Mark said you're still up there with.
Okay, since the Marcus show. Okay, so I am totally stealing Ray's thunder on this. He did all the work to create these estimates. I'm just up here bringing the news to you today. But we, as y'all probably know, report on loading to all of the base segments in different sources, where it comes from every year of the RA period. And we've got just recently the first 3 years of loading estimates from this current RA period. So that's what this is today, loading for 2022, 23, and 24. So I'm going to show you my description of what I think has happened. There's some pretty obvious, like bottom line, did we exceed, TMDLs, thresholds, that sort of thing. But I also like to tell a narrative about how the loads manifest in different forms over time that I think is an interesting story as well. I'm going to start with this one again. Basically, through this RA framework, we don't even get down to the loads until we exceed chlorophyll thresholds in at least 2 successive years. So this is more just, at this point, bookkeeping, and we don't use it in our compliance assessment framework until, again, those chlorophyll thresholds are exceeded. So that's where this kind of falls in. So each one of the base segments has a loading threshold for TN, and that's what this is shown here. Hillsborough Bay having the highest value, followed by Middle, Old Tampa Bay, and Lower Tampa Bay, and then the remainder of Lower Tampa Bay is actually the combined minor bay segments of Boca Ciega Bay, Terra Cia, and Manatee River. So those are all assessed together. And this is based on, again, a baseline period that goes back about 30 years now. So Ray went through this exercise. I kind of went through it in parallel because we're looking at eventually taking ownership of the process for calculating these loads. But this is reporting on Ray's numbers because his are more correct than mine. But basically, the last 3 years, we went through the process of calculating loads using updated land use data, updated precipitation and atmospheric data from the Verna Whalefield site, and then, of course, multiple files provided from you all about your reported loads that have come from your entities. And we allocate, or rather we define these things in one of, well, in this case, 5 different ways. Loadings coming from the atmosphere, loadings that are of domestic origin. So whether that's, discrete end of pipe surface water outfalls or from reuse or reclaimed water. Then we have industrial point sources, which does include material losses, which is a special category that's basically fertilizer losses as a function of transport at ports, basically. non-point sources, which is essentially stormwater or MS4 related loads, and then loadings coming from the groundwater, either through infiltration through the ground itself or through springs, which only Hillsborough Bay has a spring loading. And then most of you in the room have allocations for domestic, industrial, and non-point by bay segment, depending on where your entities are or your facilities are. So this is what it is so far to date, showing you the 4 major bay segments, kind of from Old Tampa Bay, Northwest, Hillsborough, Middle, Lower, and then the remainder at the very bottom. This is just total annual nitrogen load relative to the EPA thresholds right here for each of the major bay segments. I color coded these as red being above, green being below. This is the absolute loading. So the hydrologically normalized loads that we've been talking about for quite some time now, that's not what this is. This is how much has actually been estimated to enter the bay, not accounting for variation in hydrology between years. So this is through 2021, the previous RA period. If I do this, you can see what they are for the first 3 years of this current RA period. So looking just at 2021, Old Tampa Bay is above the threshold. Remainder Lower Tampa Bay is above the threshold. 2022, all are below. And then 2022, starting 22, just Old Tampa Bay. Remainder above. 23, all below. Very dry year. 2024 here, all of them except Lower Tampa Bay are above the absolute load threshold. But again, that's not how we assess compliance, so not really a big issue at this time. 2024, again, a lot of loadings from stormwater because of the storms, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. How this is, this is an ed request. How we assess this at the end of each RA period is based on the 5-year average. And so what this is showing you is basically just the rolling 5-year average for those absolute loads that I just showed you. So this would really be, we're not assessing this at each year, but at the end of each 5-year period, that's when we calculate that average. And so we still, this is on a year-to-year basis, but just to give you a sense of how relative we are, at least for the first 3 years of this RA period, to the absolute loading threshold, just based on the averages over time. Okay, now what is actually assessed if we were to hit that 2-year threshold for chlorophyll is going to be the delivery ratio for nitrogen. And this is essentially the loading corrected for hydrologic load that occurs in a particular year relative to a baseline hydrologic period from 1992-94. So it kind of plays out in terms of the thresholds based on more or less size of the sub-watershed, but Hillsborough Bay has the largest. Kind of goes down the line here, and then the remainder Lower Tampa Bay is also quite large in terms of its the threshold there. So we're looking good, and I'm not going to go into the reasons as to why this continues to decline. We've discussed this ad nauseum with the Old Tampa Bay Working Group and with you all, but for the most part, looking at the current RA period, the last 3 years, 22, 23, and 24, all below the nitrogen delivery ratios when you look at the load accounted for changes in hydrology each year. So if we were to trigger the thresholds for chlorophyll, this is where we would look next for the most part, and not suggesting a problem here, at least in terms of how we're looking at the loading ratios here. Okay, now this is, so that's basically like the regulatory assessment side of it. Now I'm gonna just go in a little more detail about the sources of nitrogen, how we define it from atmospheric deposition, domestic point source, groundwater, industrial, and non-point. Just to remind you all where these loads are coming from for the most part, and how much relative loads vary between the bay segments. So those are 2 things I think to think about as I show you this information. So this is through the previous RA period through 2021, putting on the last 3 years, 22, 23, 24. Obviously, these overall trends are just the change in total nitrogen load, but you can see which sources are contributing the most by bay segment. So we know Old Tampa Bay has the largest amount of non-point source. That tends to follow hydrology and rainfall very well, as I show in a second. So this bump up in 2024 is primarily from the storms. Lower Tampa Bay is kind of interesting. Atmospheric deposition is the largest source there, but the differences in scale on these y-axes are also important to consider, and it's hard to kind of visualize the relative loading magnitude between bay segments on this plot, but there is important differences in terms of how much overall is going to each bay segment. That's good to consider as well. So that's where I'm kind of showing you here. These are for the last 3 years, 22, 23, 24, breaking out the sources into these 5 major types: atmospheric, green, domestic, blue, industrial, burgundy, I guess, groundwater, orange, and then non-point in this sort of tan yellow color. And within each year, you can see the relative proportions. So non-point source is pretty much the dominant factor. And then these pie charts are scaled relative to all of the years within each bay segment. So you can see like Old Tampa Bay, 2024 was the largest, 23 smallest, 22 in between them. So this gives you a sense of, again, how the relative magnitudes change within each bay segment. But if we scale it proportionally across all bay segments, this is me geeking out here, but you can see like really most of the load is coming into Hillsborough Bay, and that is reflected in the total load threshold that is applied to that bay segment. But the story is loads are coming in from the rivers, from other places as well, but non-point sources are the major contributing factor. And that is really the story of how the loads play out, at least in the last couple of years. So I'm going to just wrap this up with a little bit of hydrology. This is the total hydrologic load going into each of these bay segments. And then these red lines are based on the 92 and 94 period of what is, baseline hydrology that we're comparing it to. Old Tampa Bay continues to go up over time, which is, I think, the basis for the discussion that we've been having in the last couple of years relative to the merits or how we might want to assess compliance there. But I'm showing you this first just to, again, compare it to the last couple of years where just looking at 2024 alone, this, as far as I know, is the highest hydrologic load we have so far since 1985 going into Old Tampa Bay. And the story is similar across all bay segments. Again, we had 3 storms that year that had an influence on the amount of water going into the bay. And I wanted to look at it too, going a little bit deeper, looking at essentially what is the average within each RA period for the growing season when we have typically higher chlorophyll values, to get a sense of how the hydrologic load varies by each RA period and when it might influence chlorophyll values. And so point here is like, if you look at the current RA period, here's like Old Tampa Bay. This is just looking at the totals from June through September each year. Even though we had, and the storms came in, it was Debbie in August, Milton and Helene, late September, early October, or just early October. If we just look at the growing period, those storms didn't necessarily contribute a whole lot to the overall hydrologic load for this RA period. And that is why one of the reasons I think that we're seeing lower chlorophyll overall this RA period, in addition to just 2023 being a very dry year overall. And this is looking at it by month. This is essentially, here's total TN load for the last 3 years: 2022 red, 23 green, 24 blue, and then hydrologic load. And if you squint your eyes, they look almost exactly the same. So this is actually non-point source TN load. Sorry, I should have clarified that. So the load coming from stormwater. So you would expect the two to be very strongly correlated. And these peaks right here, I think this is Ian, this one in 22. But these peaks are Helene, Milton, and well, depending on which one, this peak and remainder is, I think, Debbie. But if you look over here in the upper bay segments are the Helene and Milton signals. And for more fun, if you correlate them with one another, it's like 1-to-1. So this should not be a surprise to you all. Non-point source loading follows hydrologic load very well. And that's the end of the story there. This is the table of how the values, the annual values each year relative, how they break out relative to the TN absolute load and the TN delivery ratio, which is the normalized load for hydrology. So all base segments so far looking good for this RA period. Yep, that's what I said. Yeah, so you know, again, we're not looking at the loads just yet. This is just bookkeeping at this point. We're not going to exceed, you know, we're not going to have 2 successive years of exceeding the chlorophyll threshold just because we have 4 years of all in the green for the most part. And so we should be good for that. But again, it's very dependent on rainfall and when we get the rain. So that's the story. I'll leave it at that. Stacy. Well, it depends which source you're talking about. I'm gonna punt it to Ray.
Come up to the.
Oh, sorry. I can clarify. The question was, how do you calculate the loads? And it's not a simple answer. So some of it's simple.
I think the primary thing you're interested in is the non-point source load. Okay, so much of the watershed on the east side of the bay is gauged. And we have USGS flow gauges, and we have nearby associated EPC water quality gauges. We have measured load going past those points. That's all copacetic. That portion of the watershed where we don't have gauge loads back in the mid-90s when we were setting these things up, we developed a model that used gauged loads or gauged hydrologic loads primarily to make sure that our model was providing similar results for a similar type of watershed and land uses. So that model depends upon the amount of a certain land use within a watershed, this ungauged portion, as well as the soils types and the rainfall that hits it, and the EMCs associated with those land use types. And that gets calculated and thrown in. So for those ungauged portions, and we add those to the stuff that's upstream of gauges, and that's what we've been calling for decades now, the best estimate load for non-point source areas. So that's where it comes from. And rainfall. No, we've not updated how we're doing rainfall. It keeps their, originally there were a set of 22, 24 National Weather Service sites within the watershed and around the watershed. And basin in the Tampa Bay watershed to calculate what the expected rainfall was at that location. And recall that the loads are the minimum temporal scale on the loads that we develop from non-point source loads is monthly. So we don't have to have, every day, well, this place got a 1/4 inch and this place got a 1/2 inch, but over every month should make a pretty accurate representation. We still stick with those gauges. And that's what we're still using. So we can say that today's 2024 for subbasin, whatever, is calculated exactly the same way as it was in 1996. For those gauge areas, yeah. So primarily the EPC, because they're all over the place. We've got the EPC stuff all through Hillsborough, and then we've got the Manatee County data where we have those, and there are sites and panels that we pull as well for measured data. And there's a wonderful write-up in that really old 1996 document, which is online, which is in your library. So
And those types of questions, Stacy, are well taken because we have talked about ways to, I'm also modernize, update the methods for calculating these loads, and the rainfall one is an easy one. We could easily just drop in and get a better estimate of the loads in the ungaged portions.
You should be credit for the money. We can back it up again.
There is our discussion with according to try to build better way to estimates. Load production. I'm actually questioning the utility are basically. And that's not big, that would make that better utility.
Actually, we're trying to build those values are based on like so just to double check the age of the change, but yeah, so
Yeah, then the simple part of this is the domestic and industrial point sources. But those values are really almost 100% dependent on you all sending Ray, or in the future myself, data from your facilities. Without that information, we cannot produce these load estimates in a timely manner, and that's typically the pinch point for getting these results out when we need them. Yeah.
Our goal is to be able to provide you loading information annually. We're not there yet, so you just got a slug of 3 years, but we're trying to give it to you more frequently than just once an RA cycle. So the faster you're able to turn that information around, the faster we're able to then sort of produce this kind of information back to you all. And then you can start to make the harder decisions about whether or not you want to look at updated EMCs, changing to update with the land use with all the drift that we know has happened, and what that's going to do to people's allocations and all of these other things that all of a sudden make this work a lot more contentious, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned potentially looking at water. Do we need to take another look at atmospheric deposition based on population growth, more vehicles on the road, changes in power plant? So things like that.
Short answer is yes. That's been another point that we've talked about for the last couple of years, since I've been here, probably preceded me, but that estimate we have is based on one site that is not even in our watershed or airshed, I guess. So
It is in our airshed.
So
It's not in the watershed.
Not only that, our conversation.
Yeah.
Additional stations.
So that's still a priority of the comprehensive conservation and management plan. And in this current fiscal year 26, I've got the first half of the money that I think is needed to establish a site in the watershed. And then I'm proposing in our fiscal year 27 work plan, the second half of that. And I have been sort of teasing the need to put together an atmospheric deposition working group. Kind of slow walked it because, to be honest with you all, the old Tampa Bay work has taken up more of my time and I don't want to spread myself too thin and do it poorly. But that's really a priority for me in this upcoming calendar year, is to get that working group established. And then hopefully get an RFP on the streets to see if we can get a station established within the watershed, and any changes that may or may not be required to our methodology and our estimation techniques. Yeah.
We go one step. Keep the funding there.
Yeah.
Keep it maintenance, which is a legitimate issue. But we lost 2 in Florida. It's not easy. It's complicated, but water and but water, the lowest, very low ionic strength water, but it ends up being in those collection dust. And measuring things like nitrogen in particular is a decent beginning. Let's talk about the flight volume. Very quality insurance is really important. Any other questions? Discussion. Anything, Ed, man? Anything more than that? Anybody on time up there?
No one has their hand up. I guess I want to thank you all for being willing to make a decision today so that we're not continuing to revisit. I know it was really hard for many of you. There are people that are leaving comments in the chat, or in a private chat too. So I understand this wasn't easy for everyone, but I appreciate that you're all able to express a consensus point. If you do have dates to avoid in January or a preferred date for January, please let me know. Yeah, it's been a lot of meetings this year. For sure later in the month. What's that? Mornings better than afternoons? Okay. Okay. Mornings, late in January. I'll toss a few options out there and see what I can make stick.
Okay. Yeah. 10 years apart.